Well, hello and welcome everyone to Console Room 2025. Today we are doing the Science of Time Travel panel. We are recording this in late December of 2024. So if anything new comes out in the meantime, we won't have that on the panel. But this science is still a pretty early burgeoning field, so I'm not expecting huge discoveries in the next few weeks. I am Michael Zecca. I'm the longtime panelist here at Console Room, as part of the social media team that keeps the virtual side of the convention running. You will see me across the weekend on the Discord quite a bit, and can certainly follow up with me there if you have questions after this panel. And I'd like to go ahead and introduce my other panelists here in a moment. I just did want to throw in, since we are talking science of time travel, my background. I did start off as a physics and mathematics major, planning to do a PhD in astrophysics. I ended up taking a different route with my life, but I did do quite a bit of general relativity study during my time. It was one of my passions. I have done Einstein's notation in four-dimensional space-time. It's been quite a few years, but I have seen this stuff in the science realm. All right, my panelists, go ahead and introduce yourselves. Maybe start with Ailinn.
There we go. Hello, I am Ailinn. I am a high school teacher, longtime Doctor Who fan, and I came to this panel. This is actually my first panel ever for a convention, and I just wanted to talk about time travel because I've been a longtime fan of various time travel shows, from Doctor Who to Quantum Leap, you name it, Star Trek. You throw it in, I'm game to talk about like what works and doesn't work. So I'm kind of come from the non-science side, but I have some interest in like cosmic string theory, and just paradoxes and bootstraps and all that. So,
and Taylor.
Hi, I'm Cisco. I'm a writer mostly, and I've written quite a few novels that have time travel or time travel concepts as their central narrative plot point. I'm also a massive Whovian, been a fan pretty much my entire life. And around the same time, I was just getting into Who when I was a little kid. I also saw the old 1960 time time machine adaptation of H.G. Wells. And then I loved that. So then I went out and read the novel by H.G. Wells, The Time Machine. And then I've just been hooked to kind of give away my age around that exact same time period. Also, time travel seemed to have been breaking into the mainstream because of shows like Ailinn mentioned, like Quantum Leap, and then also, to a lesser extent, Sliders. And there's this weird little independent film trilogy called Back to the Future that you may have heard of that got really, really huge, and all those spinoffs. And so, as far as the science behind it, I'm just a massive, massive quantum physics and temporal displacement nerd. Even before I started writing about it in a fictional context, I was always following those concepts. I just love the idea of being able to traverse space and time.
Nice. All right. Well, talking about science and time travel, obviously Doctor Who being a show about time travel, this is going to come into play here, though I feel like the show has often not touched on the science behind the time travel that much. The Time Lords are a very powerful society with far more advanced science than we have, and so I think it's sort of fallen into the realm of Arthur C. Clarke's idea that any sufficiently advanced scientific achievements are going to look like magic to more primitive cultures. And certainly I think the way the TARDIS travels is a little questionable that way. That being said, let's start there just as a point of conversation. The time vortex that we see like in the opening credits, especially here in the Shidigatwa era, how does that fit in with the science of time travel for you?
Well, one of the things I like about the time vortex is that it does seem to, I don't know if this is intentional, but it feels like it's happened enough, and I haven't tracked it. But like the coloring of the vortex itself does seem, or could be argued, to follow along with the Doppler effect, because sometimes it's blue, usually when it's going in the past, and then sometimes, or it's red when it's going towards more future timelines. And so like the Doppler effect, we do know is real. The time vortex, maybe not so much, but having that element. So there's something definitely with wavelengths shrinking and growing as far as directional points that, whether intentional or not, that is being demonstrated with the time vortex. And maybe that's what they're, I don't think they did that too much in classic Who, but I know at New Who, we get a lot of time vortex scenes and situations. they all do seem to follow that kind of Doppler effect rule of like if it's blue or when something bad is happening or we're going to a future time, it's red. And there's definitely something with this idea of you are traveling a distance, a measurable distance, as well as like a more flighty concept. So there's something concrete. You're going from a point A to a point B, not just necessarily in a temporal fashion or a chronological fashion, but also like almost like space time is being mixed together there.
Ailinn, you have anything you want to add to that?
Wow. Well, I was just thinking in terms of vortex and just how it, conjures ideas of wormhole. I would let you two speak to the science of wormholes and how they work. But just the idea that the show has touched upon at some point is that like some things live in that vortex, some things don't, or that like other beings can't survive in it. Like there have been in novels and audios where somebody who is half in and out of the TARDIS when it's dematerializing is literally killed. And yet then you have Sutek happily riding on the TARDIS for...
Or Captain Jack Harkness for a few minutes.
Yeah.
Exactly. So how does that work?
Yeah. Well, one might suggest that there is a little bit of a bubble of protection around the TARDIS, some shielding or something that protects the TARDIS from the forces of the vortex. And maybe that's how they survive the ride that close. I don't think Salamander had as good a time with things, considering he was popped out of the bubble. That is a Patrick Troutner reference, by the way, Ailinn. Yeah, I feel like the vortex, especially as it's been demonstrated in Ncudi's opening credits, is very, and the 14th Doctor's opening credits as well, is very much looks like a bunch of interconnected wormholes, which is interesting. Like, is the TARDIS only following specific paths that already exist then, or is it creating new wormholes as it goes, or how is that working? For those of you that don't know what a wormhole is, it's a theoretical construct that would involve taking two black holes to curve space-time enough that they sort of connect to each other to form a portal. And this would be between 2 points in space-time. So in Star Trek, when they've done wormholes, it's generally been between 2 points in space at the same time, but that does not have to be the case. So if you think about like the Bajoran wormhole in Deep Space Nine, it was presumably to the same point, the same time in the Gamma Quadrant.
Yeah.
But it could very much be to a different point in space and time. And so given that Omega created a power source for all the TARDISes and for Time Lord Society by controlling the energy of a black hole, perhaps they're using that black hole to interact with other black holes in the universe to create these portals. That being said, trying to travel near a black hole is not a safe thing to do. Taylor, before we started this conversation, you mentioned spaghettification.
Yes.
And that's where you're basically ripped apart and spread over the event horizon, as we see happen to stars at the center of our own galaxy. At the center of other galaxies like M87, and then spews some of that material back out as a cosmic jet. So presumably the Time Lords have found some way around that.
I mean, like in universe, so we're going to kind of step a little bit away from like hardcore, like just temporal displacement, and then more into like general conceptualization of moving around in these spaces. So like if you take block universe theory, which at the simplest, and I might screw this up, so definitely feel free to correct me. But in general, basically time and space act very similar, whereas time is no longer just a abstract concept. In block universe theory, time is also on an axis, and so you can chart it, so you can actually have destinations. And a lot of Western spec fic deals in that either deliberately or accidentally, with the idea of like, oh, I'm going to type in this date, this place, and this time, and I can go there. So that's the idea of block universe theory. Very, very for dummies, rudimentary level. But the TARDIS itself is an interdimensional vessel also. So there may be something where to avoid spaghettification, it doesn't always exist at the same time in the same form. So it's like I said, we're gonna get a little abstract, but like as it's crossing through these wormholes, through the time vortex, maybe it's not all crossing through at the same time, just as the inside is much larger than the outer, what we can see outside. So if maybe it's getting small enough to avoid or at least repel the effects of traveling through the event horizon of a black hole, or it's doing it kind of like if you're trying to put something in a funnel that's not liquid, right? You got like sand, you're at the beach, you got a bunch of sand. If you put too much in too fast, it won't go through. So you got to kind of sift those particles around. That way it'll actually be able to travel through the much smaller opening like that, but just like on an infinitely massive, bigger scale.
That does actually remind me of some concepts from string theory. So when we talk about space-time, when Einstein was thinking about gravity, he was working with 4 dimensions, 3 space-like dimensions and 1 time-like dimension. Mm-hmm. Doctor Who, right from the very first episode, Susan refers to 5 dimensions. The 5th one is space. Well, it doesn't make sense because we already have 3 space-like dimensions. But what if there were 2 time-like dimensions? I don't know. But I've read up some on string theory. I have to say, for someone that had no trouble dealing with Einstein, string theory broke my brain. When Brian Greene's books on string theory came out, I did read them and I read all the footnotes, and that's where he really gets into the physics. And string theory, which, again, this is an area of physics that's been posited a lot for the last 40, 50 years, but there's no actual evidence that it exists. Sabine Hassenfelder, a German physicist, talks quite strongly about that. But in string theory, most string theory versions start with at least 10 dimensions, but most of the dimensions beyond the first 4 are what they call compact dimensions, where it's sort of like bundled up on the quantum level, where you could be doing that small stuff inside of something larger. Or so I think they're trying to use those extra dimensions to kind of explain what goes on in quantum mechanics, but in a way that it's like not, it's kind of on a small scale level. It's very weird. But maybe that's what's going on. Maybe the TARDIS is somehow in a compact dimension traveling through all this. I mean, just like the Enterprise is in a warp bubble, right? It's curving space-time around it. It's got a kind of a protective shell. And it's curving space-time to shorten the distances. It's going to places. It's really not traveling faster than the speed of light. It's shortening the universe path that it's following.
Yeah.
And that, I was going to say, NASA has actually been exploring the ideas of warp drive as an actual physical thing. They've actually figured out ways to maybe possibly make that work. It's just that the technology to do that is so far beyond anything we can do. It's just very much still a theoretical thing on paper. And that's, I think, a good example of where science fiction often drives our thinking in science.
It does. Here's
okay.
Question. At my point of view, the TARDIS is living. I mean, when you the heart of the TARDIS and Doctor's wife brings her to life, how would that impact the science? Is this just a being that transcends of these dimensions somehow?
We do talk about time-sensitive beings in Doctor Who. The Doctor's race, obviously, Time Lords are one of them. There are others. The Vortisaurs are another. Time Monster, Chronovores. What was the name of the? Is it Kronos? We're getting, and you've got some creatures that are able to sense beyond 3 dimensions. Mm-hmm. And so it could very well be that TARDISes are a similar thing, that they are a time-sensitive creature that is able to understand these other dimensions better because it lives in them. We ourselves are 4-dimensional creatures, but our perception of that 4th dimension of time is a little limited. Mm-hmm. We do perceive it. We have memories of the past. And we travel through time in one direction. Obviously, with this time travel panel, we're trying to talk about ways we could travel faster or in other directions. But if you get into a time-sensitive creature like a TARDIS, it's able to more easily deal with those things, presumably.
Well, even on like the biological scale, like in reality, right? We have organisms that, technically speaking, are immortal. So like even their notion of like having a finite lifespan, that's a concept that we can't grasp because all of us, presumably, I mean, I don't know you two that well, but I'm assuming like we all there's an end date coming, hopefully further down the line than sooner. And then to another extent, when we start mixing in things like a tardigrade, right? So they can withstand, the in theory space radiation, like outside the atmosphere, extreme pressures, all these other things. So it wouldn't be that big of a stretch. I mean, science fiction, emphasis on the fiction, but to have a living organism that the same way certain viruses are technically immortal or tardigrades are like incredibly resilient, maybe their same physical capabilities can extend to dimensional or spatio-temporal conditions. So the TARDIS itself is just sort of like a really cute tardigrade with a better sense of fashion.
Every time I hear tardigrade, that's all I think of is TARDIS.
See? Oh my God, there it is.
No,
It's a TARDIS grade. Oh, see, you just won, Ailinn. That's it. We did it. We solved it.
Taylor, I'm also reminded of Space Guild navigators from Dune,
Yeah.
who have, through generations of use of the spice melange, evolved into creatures that are more sensitive to space-time and are able to fold space.
Yeah.
So the intergalactic and interstellar travel in the Dune universe does not involve faster than light travel. It involves just connecting 2 points in space-time, basically just forming a wormhole and just popping through it in a moment. But they didn't call it wormholes, but that's kind of what they're doing. Yeah. But it took, evolving humans to a point where they have that sense of things to be able to manipulate space-time.
Absolutely. Or even going back to like Douglas Adams and like the Heart of Gold from the Hitchhiker's Guide series, where it exists in all points already because of, I mean, that gets into again more the more philosophical concepts of time travel. But if we believe Black universe theory that everything is happening and has happened and is continuing to happen simultaneously, that means, again, in theory, everything is already everywhere. So it's just a matter of how do you get one form of existence or one entity to replace the one that's somewhere else. And maybe the TARDIS has evolved to do that, where because it's already existing, like the Heart of Gold, in every possible time and point of space, it just simply says, all right, now it's my turn to go replace the one that's on hold in this area. And then it gets really, I understand why like normies don't dig time travel, because it get really wonky.
Actually, what's cool about the infinite improbability drive, it really is based in quantum mechanics.
Yeah.
You talk about, what's the position of an electron? Well, until you measure it, you don't know exactly where it is. You have a probability spread over where it will be. But then if you figure out where it is, you lose other information about what it's doing. Heisenberg's uncertainty principle tells you can only know so much about what a particle is doing. And infinite probability drive is really kind of using that to travel. It's a cool concept. Richard Feynman, famous physicist, has his own interpretation of multiple universes and so forth. His basic concept is for any possible decision, both outcomes exist. And so, I mean, we're talking about every decision down to the quantum level. So if you just think about this like in computer binary terms, just you've got a 0 or 1, right? So there's a universe where you chose 0 and there's a universe where you chose 1. And with every decision, you create new universes that have all the different possibilities. And so, when Rick and Morty plays around with parallel universes, all those exist. They're all down there on the quantum level. You're just somehow finding a way to travel between them. And Doctor Who has gone there in recent years during the Flux season, certainly, and suggesting the Doctor is from one of these parallel universes. Star Trek obviously did this with the Mirror Universe and others.
Abrams.
Abrams is a perfect example as well, where Spock has time traveled back in time, but because that changed things, he's not in the same universe he was born in, same timeline he was born in. He is in a new one that was created by those changes.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how we solve things like that grandfather paradox of Back to the Future.
I mean,
Yeah.
and expanding on that point, there's this book called The Preternaturalist by Aaron Cisco, which plays around like with that concept. Hey, look at that, it's right here. Um, but it plays around that concept of like the alternate plane theory, and then taking the multi-worlds theory to the next logical step. That it's not even just about decisions, but it's because there are infinite possibilities for every decision that could be. So it's not just that you're at the bakery and you're like, do I want a croissant or a scone? It's like when you make the decision, do you ask for it? Like, I'll have a croissant, or like, give me a croissant. Like, there's all these little nuances, but when enough of them are made, because everything everywhere is making the same infinite amount of decisions, creating these infinite possibilities. But when enough of them align in a certain way, then that creates a potential breaking point, which then causes the split.
I love
Uh,
it.
Thank
Love
you.
it.
Hey, you should check out that book. It's pretty decent. But maybe the TARDIS itself, because of the way that I mean, really it's being abused because it was not, it was stolen, and it's not really being, it's not doing what the average Time Lord would do with it. Like we
Right.
learned that pretty early on, that the Doctor and his TARDIS, or her TARDIS, their TARDIS, are kind of like rogue. And really, aside from the Master, they're the ones who really take advantage. I won't say abuse, but they take advantage of the possibilities that the TARDIS provides. So maybe that in and of itself is such a major disruption to spatial temporal reality that that's what allows it to do all these things, to travel the way that it does, and to interact with alternate planes of reality and the multiverse, because it's doing something it's not supposed to do. And that's so significant, so powerful in normal space time, that it's causing these vortexes, these rifts to open up.
Well, I
Where
think I agree because was it the Doctor's wife where she implied TARDIS ran away too? The TARDIS chose
yeah,
him for that purpose.
yeah.
So that clicks.
There were also implications there that the TARDIS often chooses his destination as to where he needs to be. So she is manipulating these events, choosing the particular timeline they need to be in to do what needs to be done.
Yeah.
Oh, and that ties back to the Heart of Gold, because if she's already there, or there's
Yeah.
some form of her, then she can know to come back to bring the Doctor to where he needs to be in order to fix what she's already witnessed. Yeah, it's getting a little wibbly wobbly.
TARDIS.
Okay. This is good. This is good. I think we'd be remiss not to cover some of the more basic time travel things that we do know about. So I said, obviously, we as human beings travel in a particular arrow in time, a particular direction. The universe seems to be, going out in a certain way, cause and effect relationships. Entropy grows across the universe. In fact, maybe time and entropy are very intertwined. The universe, it tends toward more and more entropy, less order as it goes. And that's the direction of time we're going in. If you were to become more ordered, that'd be reversing your time. There are theories of, and I know Taylor mentioned this before we started this discussion, of closed time-like curves. Physicists have posited that if you were to use some black holes to bend space-time enough, you could loop everything back on itself.
Mm-hmm.
And there's your chronic hysteresis from the Armageddon factor, or from Meglos, the time loop that the Doctor was caught in, or that he put the Marshall in. Also, there's time dilation. We know from Einstein's theory of relativity that if you move sufficiently close to the speed of light, you definitely notice a difference in how time plays out for you versus for those who are not moving at those speeds. This also happens even without the movement near large gravitational sources, because general relativity doesn't really distinguish between gravity and acceleration of anything. So we saw this in World Enough in Time. The one end of the long cyber ship, Mundasian ship, was closer to the black hole than the other. And so the two ends of the ship were experiencing time at different speeds. And so the Cybermen at the bottom of the ship, closer to the black hole, were developing faster than the ones at the top.
Yeah.
And we've even measured this experimentally. This is definitely real physics. We have two former astronauts who are twins, Mark and Scott Kelly. One's now an
Yes.
Arizona senator. And one of them spent 6 months on the International Space Station. And because they are twins, they were able to do a lot with their very similar physiognomy to measure the effect of the flight on one versus the other. That gets a little bit more esoteric, but even just putting a clock on the space shuttle or on a rocket versus a clock in the ground, you start to see a difference over time in how much time is measured on one clock versus the other. The thing in orbit, because it's moving at a very high speed around the Earth, time moves a little slower for it. So over the course of months, you may have a few seconds difference.
Well, I'd love so because time dilation is like so measurable and it's something that we have like examples of right now. I love how it's played out. The one thing I always found is really curious in Who that they don't address is like the impact of like the broad spectral time dilation. So when you take Rose, travels with nine for in like almost a year, I think it's like in real time, and then comes back to the point that she left. So in reality,
Yeah.
right, she's only 5 minutes older, but she's also a year older at the same time. Like psychologically, and that's really every companion. Any companion that travels with the Doctor, or any spec fic that deals with time travel, when they're doing that, like the events of the Back to the Future trilogy take place in one afternoon, and like that's got to have some crazy impact, and they don't really address that too much, which I always found a little curious. I mean, every so often you get, whenever, especially when they bring back some of the legacy companions, they'll kind of mention like, I've lived lifetimes, or I've waited forever and I had to move on. But it's like, also, you're simultaneously 64 years old and like 84 years old. Even like you're 64 years old, but you've lived for 84 years. And there's this weird contradictory existence because of the time dilation, like because you've gone out so far, so fast, so frequently, and then returned back to your starting point. Now you're in this weird, like, what? I mean, it feels like there's a lot of fun stories they could do there. Like maybe that explains why Mickey is such a wet blanket, like because he just couldn't handle his artist.
And it does make me think. I think two movies that handled that more might be Interstellar and The Arrival. The Arrival is one that I think really delves into that psychological simultaneous. You're seeing this, and all time is now, and like how do you cope with that?
Yeah. Also, Buzz Lightyear, like the Pixar film, which I think the reason why it bombed so hard with family audiences, it's actually a hard sci-fi story because the crux of that movie is that Buzz, because he's doing those warp hole. I forgot what language they use, but he's trying to figure out a way to get the ship to go faster. But every time he does it, like he's aging a matter of minutes, but everyone back on the planet they're stuck on is aging years.
Yeah,
it's like this is a heavy concept for like the 8-year-old set. But
going back to Arrival, Ailinn, one of the strong concepts there is that the aliens in that story are more time sensitive, and their language structure is based in that.
Yeah.
They're forming sentences that are thinking backwards and forwards in time a bit. And what's interesting in that story, because I've read the short story it's based on as well, that main character Amy Adams was playing is starting to develop that same sense over the course of the story. She's having flashes forward to the child she will have someday. It's interesting concept. Yeah, I was going to say also to Taylor, you were saying that the companions, we usually don't get that effect of the time, but I think there's at least one good example in Doctor Who where they did cover that, and that's Amy Pond.
Oh, okay.
We definitely saw Amy. She waited from age 8 to 21 for the Doctor, and he was gone for 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And then we went through this again at the end when she and Rory were separated, and then separated from the Doctor by the Weeping Angels.
Yeah.
We did that a little bit in the Flux with the Weeping Angels as well, with characters in there. So they do that sometimes. I think another place Stephen Moffat stole from and used in Doctor Who, and then he went and did a TV adaptation of it anyway, which was A Time Traveler's Wife.
Yeah.
The whole concept of, meeting your spouse out of order. We did that with
Yeah.
River's Song, but it was clearly based on Audrey Neffenegger's book. Um, that is an interesting concept to like get to know somebody out of order. But in a time travel show, that should be happening more. I mean, the Doctor runs into the Brigadier a lot across his life, but he always seems to run into him a little bit older, and a little bit older, and a little bit older. He doesn't run out of sequence, but he should.
And is that because River is also a time traveler and the Brigadier isn't?
Maybe, but even the Time Lords, the Master, the Time Lords, the Doctor always seems to catch them in sequence. Although there's some limiters on the TARDISes to keep Time Lords from catching each other out of sequence, but yet that didn't stop him from meeting himself and the two Doctors.
No.
So I think it really has to do more with the fact that they're using actors who age. But, they could do a story where, Ncuti Gatwa runs into a younger version of the Brigadier played by a different actor.
It could now, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it could happen. But then it might call into question some things about what he knows and doesn't know about the Doctor when he runs into him as Patrick Troughton.
And maybe that's one of the rules that the Time Lords, or the Doctor at least, follow. The TARDIS enforces. It's just sort of like, look, we know that humans are going to have a hard time with this. So just to keep things clean for their sake, because the TARDIS is a very empathetic creature.
Yeah.
He's just like, all right, when you bump into these folks, like, where are we going? All right, I got to make sure that when we go back here to this event, we're not going to interrupt things that have happened. I mean, they even mentioned a little bit in, was it Day of the Doctor, Name of the Doctor? Like, when 11 was kind of mentioned, like, the one place that Time Lord never goes is to, like, their grave. So there are some sort of like soft rules that they kind of follow ostensibly to kind of keep things like just in order to avoid, at the very least, uncomfortable conversations. And of course, on the worst side of things, like, complete breakdown and get into things like, grandfather's paradox and all that silliness. And also the canon. That's the ultimate power in the universe, of course, right? It's narrative canon. You don't want to piss off the fans.
No.
Because especially Whovians, we'd be the first ones like, wait a second. So if 15 is talking with Brigadier here, and the Brigadier is only like a cadet, then why doesn't he have any recollection when he meets 3 or 4 or 10, etc.? Yeah. So the TARDIS is a very powerful being, but none are more powerful than the canon.
Here's just a question, maybe, especially for the audience. If somebody wanted to delve into the science of this themselves, what might be like a good book or podcast or YouTube channel, maybe, that people could recommend?
Book-wise, I think Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time is a really good place to start. It's good popular level science book on general relativity and things related to that. Hawking himself was a cosmologist who studied black holes, so he definitely understands Einstein well. Podcast wise, I don't know about time travel itself, but she touches on that and string theory and other things at times. But Sabine Hassenfelder is a German physicist I follow on YouTube who really gets into physics concepts quite well. She frankly is challenging a lot of the physics industry on maybe spending too much time on theoretical math stuff and not looking at evidence to support things. There's a lot of good science communicators on social media as well, on Instagram, on TikTok, on Blue Sky, on formerly Twitter, some of whom talk about some of these things some of the time. But Taylor, you got any?
I mean, I would definitely co-sign Brief History of Time by Hawking, anything by Hawking for that matter. I'd probably throw in maybe Time Travel in Einstein's Universe, but I think that Gott is the last name, Gott. I believe that's how you spell it, or Gatt. That one's pretty groovy. It's pretty easy. I mean, you do have to have at least a fundamental grasp of certain concepts, but you don't have to be like really steeped in it. I wouldn't call it layman, but it's definitely it's more digestible than some of the heavier works. Hyperspace was a good one. Oh shoot, who wrote that one? I could Google that one. But Hyperspace was pretty good. Another good book on that. Nonfiction or science books on time travel. Oh, The Order of Time was also good. Ravelli. That one's a little bit newer. That one's not bad.
If string theory, I would say Brian Greene's The Elegant Universe.
Yes.
Although, again, if you don't have the background in physics, don't read the footnotes. Okay, I have the background in Einstein's space-time calculations and all, and I read the footnotes and my brain peed itself. So yeah, it does get a little bit thick in the footnotes, but I think the presentation is pretty good otherwise. For the Brits, I'm sure Brian Cox covers this stuff pretty well in some of his works as well.
Oh yeah, Quantum Universe. Yeah,
and we've seen him on Doctor Who. Yeah. That's Brian Cox, the astrophysicist, not Brian Cox, the actor.
Although he might have some interesting points of consideration there.
Yeah. 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 And if you really want to, go deep into things, there are college libraries that still have copies of Einstein's papers in the original German. I used to pull down copies of Annalen der Physik from the 1890s and early 1900s and flip through them in my university library during my university days. It was a physics journal that was published up through about 1930 or so, and that's where all of Einstein's famous papers were published, including the one on the photoelectric effect that got him the Nobel Prize in Physics. He did not win it for his relativity work.
Good to know.
Yeah. It actually took the physics community a long time to accept Einstein. That's part of the reason he didn't win a Nobel for relativity.
Yeah, yeah.
There was a solar eclipse in 1919 that helped prove some of his points and start to bring some of them around, but it was still decades before some of them were fully on board.
I don't have a whole lot of recommendations that you guys haven't already.
Yeah.
I do watch, there's a YouTuber named Anton Petrov.
Oh yeah, Anton's fantastic.
I love him just because he's relatable to somebody like me who doesn't have that background. But he does cover a variety of stuff, not just time travel, but astrophysics.
And he tends to stay on top of contemporary discoveries, but he's also extremely positive in his presentation.
Yes.
Which I really appreciate.
Says, hello, beautiful people.
Yes. Sabina that I mentioned can get a little more dark sometimes. She's very German, but yeah. Right. I forget.
I think Taryn, you had mentioned maybe talking about some of the Doctor Who episodes that got time travel right or did them well.
That was more of a question.
Well,
like were there? No, for sure. Are there? I mean,
World Enough in Time, definitely.
Okay. Yes.
The time dilation stuff around the black hole. I think they really hit it well there. And the Impossible Planet Satan Pit was also sort of delving into that a little bit as well, because they were also near a black hole.
Yeah.
It wasn't just central to the plot there, though.
No, it wasn't. That one was different. And then the one with the Cybermen on the ship. Do you remember the name of that?
That was the one I was talking about, World Enough in Time.
Yeah.
Yep.
I mean,
I think this kind of this answers that original question that we started with
I will
show is about it, but it doesn't really.
Right. I will say when you start talking about things looping back on itself and events causing effects and vice versa, Back to the Future kind of stories, I think Stephen Moffat was big on that. We saw a lot of that during the Amy Pond era. Not only with Amy herself, but also with the Doctor during the whole astronaut thing. The Doctor supposedly dying at the beginning of the season and then figuring out, how that came about. And even the first season with Amy with the whole rift in space time and how that played into the finale and how things looped back on itself. I mean, there was a scene in the Angels episode that season. It was a two-parter called with Glenn. There's a scene where the Doctor's talking to Amy, and people at the time are going, wait a minute, why is he dressed like that? This doesn't seem like it fits the continuity. And then it turns out, well, that's the Doctor from the end of the season coming back and visiting her and giving her some crucial information.
Yeah.
They do sometimes do that, and Moffat likes to play the long game with his storytelling that way. He's very good at that sort of thing.
Like there's a tiny moment. So still trying to think of, like what I consider a good time. Like on the softer side of the time travel question, there's a tiny moment at the end of Vincent and the Doctor. Of course, when they bring Vincent, spoilers, for got it 14 years old now in the episode. So mild spoilers. When they bring Vincent van Gogh to the future to see his impact, hoping that it will somehow do something. And then of course they realize like, no, nothing has changed. So that was more like a passing reference, didn't really delve into that too much. But and I know as much as people love Vincent and the Doctor, I prefer a very similar episode from the previous, I want to say it was like 3 seasons earlier, Father's Day, which is a Rose story, where she goes back, and that's more like the many worlds theory or alternate realities and impacting time and the consequences. We get giant Langoliers that are going to eat you and stuff like that if you start screwing around with things. But that idea of like time being a fixed series of a sequence of events, so getting away from like block universe theory into more like sequential linear time, and like it has to correct itself because it's in like Newtonian physics, but applying those to time, spatial temporal existence. So when she goes back and she saves her dad, and then now time is trying to recorrect itself because for every reaction there's the equal opposite, etc. I thought that handled that really, really well. And even though they don't explicitly discuss the concepts that they're demonstrating, they do demonstrate them well. To the point that like if you point to that episode and start saying, okay, well, this is talking about like, course correction. This is breaking a linear spatial temporal progression. Then people are like, oh, okay, I get that because she saved her dad was supposed to die. Now the Langolier creatures are going to come and eat. Okay. So it was like a nice, again, digestible way to get some of the heavier concepts. But like, it wasn't really a time travel, except that they were messing around with time. It was more of a time.
It was consequences of time travel. Was really what it was about. Yeah.
Yeah.
To a lesser extent, I think Inferno. We have some moments in Inferno where there's the Doctor and Joe see each other, 30 seconds, whatever, out of joint. Like they're talking to themselves, like, wait a minute, what's going on? And then 30 seconds later, they're doing the other side of it. And then we also do crossover into a parallel timeline in that story as well. And kind of see how things are playing out in that other timeline for, like 3 episodes of a 7-parter. So,
well, just even the Don't Blink episode, the Don't Blink speech, and the whole idea that the Doctor at some point in his busy life is going to have the time to go back, get these transcripts.
Yes.
Put all these things in these DVDs.
And without describing the spoilers too much, there is a moment in the 2024 Christmas special, Joy to the World, that's kind of like that as well. Being able to communicate information to yourself out of joint and so forth. And the Doctor does that a lot in the Sylvester McCoy era, but a lot of it's off screen.
Yes.
The whole manipulative Doctor thing, he's got foreknowledge of stuff, and he's actually, future versions of himself are leaving him information, and this is touched more on in novels and stuff later on, or in the novelizations of some of the televised stories, but definitely something going on there.
Do we mention, I don't remember the episode title, but the whole Impossible Girl resolution? Again, spoilers, where it turns out that Clara was the Impossible Girl and she's able to reinsert herself back into the Doctor's timeline to go back.
That was Name of the Doctor.
That's Name of the Doctor.
Yeah,
okay.
That was Name of the Doctor, yeah. It ends with introducing John Hurt as the doctor.
Right. But it's that notion that like, because then we get one of the things I love about when we get to like the heavier conceptual theoretical sciences is that they start getting almost like dovetailed with like more of the metaphysical and philosophical. Because Impossible Girl almost plays with like predestination.
Yeah.
It's like, well, she's the one who's like, nope, doctor, I think you want that TARDIS. It's like, well, okay, so in theory, again, we follow this all the way. If Clara hadn't, the Impossible Girl hadn't told the doctor, would there not have been? I think it's all fun and will be wobbly again with that one. But yeah, the time travel in Doctor Who, that's what it always kind of plays because like there's that old argument, right? Like is Doctor Who more sci-fi? Is it fantasy? Is it space opera? The answer usually is, of course, like a little bit of everything, but it does seem to lean a lot further into more of the fantasy
Hmm.
realm as opposed to like the hard sci-fi. Even though they do, like we kind of mentioned, play with some of these concepts, they always do it in a very soft way, or they'll mention something in passing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The whole thing with Clara and his timeline she be all through his timeline? So shouldn't we still be getting cameos from Jenna
Yeah.
Coleman? She could pop up in a Shooty episode and push him out of the way of something. He doesn't know who she is. He has no memory of her now. And she can just, go away. And he's just wondering, who was that lady? We could have some fun with that.
Which was one of my favorite fan theories in the debut episode, or Shooty's first full episode without Tennant, that the old woman who is
Oh,
Ruby Sunday's neighbor,
Oh,
that
Mrs.
was
Flood.
Clara. And I
yeah.
was like, well, I don't think so, but I like that. I like if that's the case, that would
Yeah.
be kind of fun.
That'd
But
be a
Yeah.
very creepy version.
I do love, and this is not getting into the science of time travel too much, but I do love in Listen, which is actually one of my favorites of the modern era, that Clara was the monster under the doctor's bed that drove him to do all the things he's done all these years. And again, that's a point where she's crossed back into his past. So getting companions to meet the doctor out of order is kind of interesting when we do it like that.
that would be fun. And that's another one they haven't really, because even the other way, so we've had companions that don't recognize former companions, but the doctor always does. And there's always that throwaway
Yeah.
lines like, oh, I used to travel, I used to be like you, etc. But it seems again, there's a lot of narrative space for an episode or a storyline where there's someone who's like, oh, doctor. And he's like, what? Because they haven't met yet. And it's a companion from a future
Yeah.
incarnation that's now backwards.
Right.
Or, yeah, that
But
would be.
that's that river.
True.
Oh, yeah.
There is a moment like that at the end of the Five Doctors with Sarah Jane, where she's talking to Peter Davison's doctor and John Pertwee's answering, and she's like looking at him like, "Why? I'll explain later." Yeah. And I guess we did actually do some time travel with a companion in Modern Undead, where the Doctor was meeting Antigon and Nissa were meeting the Brigadier out of sequence.
Mm.
But this is another one that, like in the Moffat area, really kind of paid off, where there were seeds early in the episode that paid off at the end, where it's actually the meeting of the two Brigadiers that releases a bunch of temporal energy
Yes.
that erases the younger brigadier's memory, so he has no memory of this
Yes.
when they meet him as the older brigadier. And the Blinovich limitation effect, which originally was just a throwaway line from John Pertwee, I think, in Inferno. So, yeah, this whole idea that you shouldn't meet yourself because and I think that the cool thing there is the idea that this temporal energy built up, like, if you lift a rock up a hill, there's gravitational potential energy stored in the rock. And then when it rolls down the hill, it uses that energy to make it into kinetic energy to make it roll. And it's sort of the idea that with having time travel, you've stored up this potential energy that then gets released. Or it's a little more similar to like, a voltage, an electrical charge that's kind of built up. That's kind of how I think of the Blinovich limitation effect.
Is that Artron energy?
Yeah.
Like anybody who's traveled in the vortex gives off that energy.
Yeah, Artron energy is kind of that Doctor Who throwaway term for time-related energy. The way Doctor Who like Star Trek likes to throw around Verteron particles and chronotons, for time travel and things like that. There are actually physicists do actually talk about a theoretical particle that can travel faster than the speed of light and thus travels back in time, and it's called a tachyon.
Yes.
And so you'll see sci-fi films refer to tachyons, but it's just basically a term that was invented to describe, okay, if such particles existed, this is the name we're going to give to them. There is an interpretation in quantum mechanics, and particularly in Feynman's diagrams of quantum mechanics. It's not suggesting that antimatter travels back in time, but because of the things that are similar and the things that are opposite between matter and antimatter, antimatter kind of looks like matter moving backwards in time from a certain point of view.
Mm.
And so in Feynman diagrams, and a Feynman diagram is a way of representing like a nuclear reaction or a subatomic nuclear reaction thing down at the quantum scale. It's a simplified diagram to show what's going on. And the arrows of like what's coming in, if they're matter like an electron, the arrow is coming into the collision, but the antimatter arrow is drawn in the opposite direction, like it's coming out, coming backwards in time. And it's sort of a weird interpretation because we have like an electron and a positron, which is or an anti-electron. They have the same mass, they have the same spin, but they have opposite charges. And from a certain point of view, they have an opposite direction of time.
Well, that ties in. Wasn't it Hawking who said time travel backwards is impossible because you have to create a whole new you?
Or a whole new universe that you exist in, having done that change. Yeah, I mean, this is what gets in the little grandfather paradox thing, too. Great sci-fi novel that gets into that in ways from the 70s is called The Man Who Folded Himself by David Gerald. Mm-hmm. It's a short book. It's an easy read, but the lead character is a teenager who's handed a time traveling belt by his dying uncle, who he's named after, in the opening scene. And this book gets very wibbly wobbly and timey-wimey from there. He ends up crossing over his own timeline so many times he's having poker games with several versions of himself. And he ultimately ends up dating a female version of himself. And it gets very complicated, but it's a wonderful little book that covers this wibbly wobbly timey-wiminess. When we talk about the whole Georgia Moffat played the doctor's daughter, but in real life she's the doctor's daughter, and it gets wibbly wobbly, timey wimey, and sesty westy. That's that book. So, yeah. So that's fiction, but it covers those really well. I will say that one's been out of print for a few years. There was a reprinting a dozen or so years ago, but you still sometimes scrape up a copy in a library if you're lucky. There's at least one downtown Minneapolis. All right. Well, and talking about things traveling faster than the speed of light, and thus being able to travel backwards in time, there is an odd effect that, the speed of light changes depending on the medium it's traveling through. When we're talking about time dilation and relativity, we're usually talking about in relation to the speed of light in a vacuum, C. But when you talk about the speed of light in, say, water, it's slower than C. And there are a few substances out there in which light, at least at certain frequencies, does not pass easily, and thus other things travel faster than the speed of light in that medium. Does that mean that they're experiencing time differently in that medium? I don't know. So if you think about some brick that it looks black to you, it's because it's absorbing light, right? But the light doesn't pass through the brick necessarily. So the light is getting slowed down to a stop somewhere in there. But if you send a sound wave through it, the sound still travels through there.
Right.
So in that case, sound is sort of effectively traveling faster than light.
Right.
Oh, Jesus. So that'd be like
Yeah.
applying like the concept of like was it nothing space, where like particle free, energy free, that's just like creating a field or an area where there actually is nothing, going back to like what the universe is hanging off of or where it came out of. Because then and there's no rules. So is that, oh my God. So like, that's Gallifrey. That's what the Time Lords have tapped into, because once you're in there, that's when you're writing the rules. Because if you have things where light particles can't penetrate or are slowed down substantially, but they still possess the capabilities to traverse like temporal spatial distances. You can slow them down enough in theory then to then kind of ride that, because we can't do
Well,
it because we'd be, yeah.
when we get into quantum mechanics, we talk about you needing to have particles to transmit the information from one place to another for things to happen and for things to know things have happened. Light is the transmission method for some of the fundamental forces of the universe. There's other particles for others. But light is a primary one. So if the light can't move through, does that mean then you're not getting that cause and effect, right? Because the light's not getting there to tell it, hey, this has happened. That's interesting. It might explain like the no rooms from Herbert's Dune books, which are sort of like a stasis bubble, but it's like it's also kind of like the zero room. It's kind of like outside of space time, or I guess it's more like where Tic-Taoyun was in the Flux, kind of outside space and time, but somehow preserved in a place where they could still exist outside of space and time. Between universes, or I guess pocket dimension that Gallifrey was put in Day of the Doctor, same idea. Big Finish did a thing with their 40th anniversary where they put the Doctor and his companions after that for a while in a universe that had no time, which really made no sense to me because there certainly seemed to be a passage of time there, but they certainly didn't have a sense of time in this universe. The time, like they said in Day of the Doctor they were going to put the Gallifrey in a pocket universe that was frozen in time. So, you would have no concept of anything. It's not like life would be going on Gallifrey. They're just literally just frozen. Mm-hmm. So when Gallifrey came back out at some point later, it picked up right where it left off at the end of the Day of the Doctor, presumably.
Unless.
No. To break your brain. Yeah. Unless you get it into dimensions that run at different times. And that's a thing that's been positive in science fiction sometimes, is you could have parallel universes,
time zones.
Parallel universes that come in contact with each other, and so you have some way of traveling back and forth, but they don't experience time at the same rate. So, and in like D&D, the Fey world's like this, where you can go to a Fey realm and time moves very differently. In 5 years might go by for you, and it was 30 seconds for your friends who were left behind. It could be like that between universes. I think the laws of physics don't have to be the same for both universes, right?
Farscape did that in an episode where he was trapped on a planet and time passing differently.
Yeah. I think Deep Space Nine did as well, and the Orville has. And also in Star Trek Discovery, they sort of suggested the mirror universe was closer physically or whatever in the multiverse to our universe at a point back closer to the original series. And as we've moved on past the year 3000, they've become more physically separated, and that's causing Empress Georgiou some issues in the future. There's a wonderful little series that only lasted 2 seasons called Counterpart that starred J.K. Simmons. I think it was on Starz Network, and it involves a temporal Cold War. Basically, not a temporal Cold War exactly, but a parallel universe Cold War between 2 parallel Earths. It's set in Berlin, near the Berlin Wall, but that's the passage between the 2 universes. And in the other universe, they're actually a few years ahead of us. Not too far ahead of us, but a few years ahead of us. But in theirs, they had a major pandemic in 2020. And this was filmed before 2020. I watched this show during lockdown, and they had a pandemic in 2020 that wiped out a good portion of the population. And the reason there's Cold War going on is the people in that universe that lost people are kind of holding it against our universe for infecting it in the first place.
Well, is Wild Blue Yonder, the episode, Tennant and Donna, kind of implies that because they're at the edge of the universe, thoughts, words literally can change the laws of the universe and bring things into being.
Now, I will say physics is going to have a difficult concept of the idea of an edge of a universe.
Yeah.
But if you were talking about some boundary between two parallel universes that had different laws of physics, I could see where the laws are starting to break down at that point. And I think that explains Wild Blue Yonder pretty well. Doctor Who has dipped into the idea of creatures that are either from other universes or from previous universes to our own that somehow survived the cataclysm that then led to the Big Bang and then the creation of our universe, that have very different laws of physics.
Yeah.
The Troughton story, The Mind Robber, is one of those examples. The Celestial Toymaker is another example of that. Mm-hmm. And on audio, Big Finish has the Word Lords.
Oh, yes, I love that
one. Who language is far more important in how they do things. They manipulate language the way the Doctor manipulates time. Mm-hmm. It does get interesting. You start talking about other types of physics. The problem that really I have trouble with in sci-fi is when two universes with very different laws of physics somehow come in contact with each other, even if it's just one person traveling to the other. How do they keep existing?
Yeah.
How do they not get just destroyed immediately or melt or something?
Implode something.
Omega did something when the Doctor was brought into an antimatter universe to preserve him and basically convert him from matter to antimatter so he could survive there. Yeah. But if you just wandered into a parallel universe where the gravitational constant of the universe is 20% less, would your atoms in your body work the way they're supposed to in that universe? Would you fall apart?
Yeah, exactly.
Also, we talk about direction of time. The Star Trek animated series had an episode called The Counterclock Incident, which involved a parallel universe where the time ran backwards. And so effect preceded cause.
Red Dwarf.
You would be born as an old person and get younger as time went on.
Yeah. Red Dwarf, though, I don't remember the name of the episode. Hilarious episode where they are on a universe. They have to actually speak backwards and everything.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, and it was like that in the Counterclock Incident initially as well. And then there was something that they did to manipulate things so they could basically get the universal translator to flip it for them.
A fun concept too would be, so bringing back to biology, right? So time doesn't really exist. It's a perceivable force, not a tangible element, but it impacts everyone like distinctly. So like what we call aging is really just senescence, like our cells do things for whatever amount of time is like the name we give to like just give it a sense of measurement.
Right.
But everyone's like cellular degradation is different. So is there also temporal degradation? And I think there was a Trek, maybe it wasn't Trek. No, it wasn't Trek. But someone did an episode with that. Oh, it was Trek. Sorry. I'm gonna lose my Trekkie card here, and it's embarrassing because I helped run a trivia. But
which series?
Voyager, the Ocampa.
Yeah.
Like like it's more than just like a growth rate. Like they're born, but then they rapidly age and mature. It's almost like they have a fruit fly kind of. But it's done temporally, like they're able to mature, even though it's still gross that you hooked up with Neelix. That's for another panel. Like this notion of like interacting with, because in theory, if you pull Cass off of the Ocampan homeworld and then put her onto the deck of the USS Voyager, which has artificial gravity and environmental controls that are completely different and actually would be fatal or hazardous to her, she just adapts. So maybe that's the loophole for these alternate universe visitors. It's just like adaptation is quick. Now, granted, if the gravitational constant is so different that you're in danger of like breaking down at the atomic level, That's probably not a Darwinian adaptation you can pick up really quickly, but I mean, maybe that's the cool part of that alternate universe is that they do have like hyper realized adaptive skills.
Well,
Super.
I hate to say it. I think I have to end us on that note because I'm realizing we're at about an hour.
We are.
Thank you both for a really fun conversation about time travel and science. Again, if anybody's looking for some more discussion about this, come find me on the Discord after the panel. I'm sure I can have a conversation with you there. Anybody you want to plug before we sign off today?
Read to Aaron's book.
Oh, thank you. Support teachers because Aylin's amazing and she's an exceptional one, but you should still support the ones who are lesser than anyway, because teachers are awesome. We're all here because of teachers. Also, if you've watched this from the beginning, you've participated in a little time travel yourself. It is now 60 minutes in the future. That's right. You're welcome.
And I'll just plug that if you want to see some more science this weekend, I'm also going to be recording a panel all by myself about the Northern Lights and the solar maximum that we've experienced this past year, including a number of pictures I've taken myself.
Been gorgeous this year.
All right. Well, thank you all for being here and enjoy the rest of Console Room 2025. See you around the convention.